I love that. I want to start off today by asking you an important question. What label defines you? Is it the role that you play at school, like band, sports, cheerleading, theater, or being the most entertaining person in class? Or is it what others say about you? Funny, nice, quiet, loud? Is it what your parents say about you, like how you compare to your siblings, your step-siblings, or what you were like when you were younger? So what label defines you? To answer this question, I want to share two labels I had growing up. The first label I received when I was a kid was the Chinese kid. So of course, I was stereotyped. So that means I knew karate, which is Japanese, by the way, but I digress. But people just assumed that I was good at math, which I was right up until they started adding the alphabet into math equations, and that's when I just plummeted in math. Now, the second label I received has to do something with church. A lot of my classmates knew that I was a church kid, so that means I didn't do anything bad, I didn't cuss, I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't mess with drugs, and I didn't run around with girls who did. And here's the thing about these two labels is that I tried to live up to others' expectations of me. And in fact, these labels became my identity. They became the things that I wanted to be known for and what I wanted to be known as a self-righteous, karate-kicking mathematician. See, the truth is, labels are a big deal. So what do we do with them? Who has the right to label us? And do we have the right to label other people? Today, we're going to look at the story of someone who had one of the worst possible labels of her time. And the story opens up with Jesus talking to a man named Jairus, who was a high-ranking religious leader. Jairus was rich and powerful, and he came to see Jesus because his daughter was dying. Jairus was desperate for Jesus to come to his house and to see her. So together they start walking to Jairus' house. And then something strange happened. And it says in Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 26, it says, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered for a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. We don't know a lot about this woman, but we know she's an outcast. She had an illness that caused her to get one of the most uncomfortable labels in her society, unclean. That didn't mean that she needed to shower. It was her identity. She was forced to live on the outskirts of town. She couldn't interact with people like a normal person. Kind of like how we've been quarantined the last couple of months, except the whole town kept their distance from her for 12 years. Now, on top of that, she had spent all her money on doctors, only to hear that there was no hope. In other words, she had been told unclean would be her label for life. In her desperate situation, this woman does something that no one expected. And it continues in Mark chapter 5. It says this, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him and in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I could just touch his clothes, I will be healed. This woman knew how everyone else saw her. She had no place in society. She definitely wasn't supposed to touch anybody, but she was convinced that Jesus was somehow different. Listen to what happens in the next verses in 29 and 30. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in a crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" In a huge crowd, it could have been anyone. Jesus' followers was trying to convince him to keep moving, but Jesus was certain that something important just happened. He just felt it. Now, terrified, the woman falls to the ground and admits what she has done. And what happens next is simply amazing. In verse 34, it says, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." In 2 sentences, this woman's life was flipped. Jesus changed everything. Did you see what he called her? Daughter. To a woman who had been completely avoided, who had been kicked out, kept out, Jesus called her his child. This is the only recorded time in history when Jesus uses this word. Now, the bleeding woman was unlikely candidate to receive this new powerful label in one word, daughter. Her identity changed, and all of a sudden she saw herself differently. When Jesus said, "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering," the woman was physically healed. She stopped bleeding. But Jesus was referring to more than just her physical suffering. I think he saw a woman whose labels caused her a lot of pain. She was living under the opinions and judgments of other people, and she was suffering because of it. So Jesus gives her a new label, one that frees her from being a victim of everyone else's label, one that freed her from being a victim of her own label. Jesus invited her to let him decide who she was, and he called her daughter. Jesus flipped this woman's identity. She thought she was a nobody. The whole town saw her as a nobody. Jesus told her she was a somebody. She mattered. Jesus' cleanness made her uncleanness clean. His identity affected her, not the other way around. And as we see, there's a label that beats all other labels, his. Labels are temporary. They're small picture. We make decisions about ourselves and other people without all the information. God sees everything, and that's why there's a label that beats all other labels, his. Like the woman in the story, many of you have given yourself labels, or they've been given to you, and you have felt trapped by them. You feel like you either need to live up to them or live them down. Some of you already decided, I'm just a dumb kid. Or maybe you're thinking, I'm just a lazy kid. Or maybe you have heard a lot of disappointment or not enough declarations like, I'm not pretty enough, or I'm not skinny enough. You may be smart, you might be pretty or even skinny, but it's still not enough when you compare yourself to what's out there. Now, we've been given, or you've been given, some pretty serious labels, but you've never considered being, doing, or trying something else. Some of you look at the family you come from and made some decisions about who you are based on your family's financial situation. It's divorce or dysfunction, and you've labeled yourself as a victim of your family. Now, some of you come to church, but you feel like you don't fit in based on your past or maybe some bad decisions you made. And so then you decided that this place is a place where you'll never belong. Here's the deal. Today, I want you to walk away with your identity flipped. It starts by asking yourself two very big questions. First one is this: who gets to label you? Decide who gets to define you. Pay attention to your words. What kind of things are you saying about yourself? What kind of things are you believing? If a label enters your mind, don't ignore it. Ask yourself, is this true? Or is it just a temporary label based on what I can see? Now, while I'm bombarding with all these questions, here I want to ask you a few more to think about. Are you allowing your past to define you? Are you allowing your past to define your relationships or even your achievements? Here's something else to think about. Are you allowing your past to define other people? Now, the second question I want you to ask yourself is, who gets to label them? When you look at other people, you will be tempted to see people through the filter of their label. You'll see some unclean, unimportant, unlovable, or you'll see others as rich, popular, or powerful. Most of the time, you won't even notice that you're doing it. Most people, once they've established people's labels, then determine how they'll treat those people. It's like the label creates the worth. And if we're not careful, we'll allow the label to determine the worth. And it will mistreat some of the people that Jesus paid the most attention to. But there's a different option. What if you allowed Jesus to lead the way? What if you allowed him to put his label on your friends, on your family members, on your classmates or your teammates? Maybe a bigger question is this: will you then treat them accordingly? Like you, Jesus calls them his sons and daughters, and that label is permanent, and it trumps every other one. People encountered Jesus who had lives flipped. In this case, he changed a woman's label. By doing so, he changed the way people thought about her and the way she thought about herself. So you have the power to do the same thing. As you head to breakout groups, I want you to imagine what it would look like to live with one label on yourself and others, and how that one change the way you think about would affect your world. And I want you to think about the people who have tremendous value in Jesus' eyes. How are you going to treat them from here on out? Because there's a label that beats all other labels. It's his.